So good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to see you at this first of two fundraising strategy meetings presented under the ABCD Programme for Cultural Recovery here in Brighton and Hove. The ABCD plan very much starts from the understanding that, or the belief that creative and cultural organisations and artists, seen in their widest sense, will be at the forefront of the recovery in the city, and that we have a huge opportunity here to use this moment to think differently and to introduce ideas and strategies that might help us to grow, to do things differently, and to build more resilient, diverse, and supportive sector for us all to work in. This is the engine room strand, which is all about support for cultural organisations, enabling people to support each other and basically to try and bring together the creative community across Greater Brighton. And this is actually our first public event, so it's great to have you all here. The session is being recorded and we will make the recording available to you. There will also be an Otter AI transcription you can access, and as Lucy mentioned, the captioning is enabled, so you can enable that for yourself at the bottom of your screen. So I'm just going to ask Lucy to say a little bit about where this particular session came from and why we were very keen to invite Rachel here to speak to us. So Lucy, if I could just pass to you.
Hello everyone. Well, it's good afternoon for us, but it's good morning for Rachel. As you will hear from her accent, she's joining us from the US. These sessions came about because there was some funding available to run some sessions, and very much felt that when it comes to strategy, they're often very boring, they often sit on the shelf, and they often don't include everybody in that conversation. So rather than looking at sessions like, here are the pieces you need to put together in order to make a strategy, these two sessions are really about, here is the thinking that you need to do in order to put together a strategy. Rachel will give us amazing insight into community-centric fundraising, which, as you'll have read from the intro, information about this session is a movement that's very much in the making. We should all be knowledgeable about. And then Wayne will be doing a session next month. I think Wayne is here as well, really looking at how you include everybody in those conversations and how you ensure that your strategy is kind of people focused and human centric. So I will leave Rachel to introduce herself and do the session. So she'll be talking for about an hour, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A afterwards.
Thank you, Lucy. Can I just get a thumbs up that you all can see my screen?
We can see your screen. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome. As Polly and Lucy shared, I am coming to you from St. Louis, Missouri, where it's a little after 9 o'clock in the morning. I just got my kids out the door, so I'm happy to spend this first part of my day with you all today. A little bit about myself. First of all, if you are Twitter people, you are more than welcome to connect with me there or share any insights that you have. I am born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri in the United States, but my parents immigrated to St. Louis from Goa, India in the 70s. So my brothers and I grew up here, and St. Louis is a little bit of a a strange place in terms of the fact that our community is very segregated by race. So there's very white areas, there are very Black areas, and then if you are a non-Black person of color like me and my family, you kind of just find a place to be, and there you are. So for my life and growing up in St. Louis, I have always wanted to be a person that connects people, that builds bridges, that finds ways to have people work together and use their resources for the highest and best benefit of our community. I got into fundraising after finishing my master's degree in public policy administration more years ago than I care to share with you. And really have been trying to figure out, how do we as fundraisers who are supporting nonprofit cultural institutions in our communities, how are we able to do more than hit a budget number or get a gift? Like, how do we actually begin to figure out ways to help our organizations achieve their missions and their visions for the stakeholders in the communities that we serve? So that is a little bit about me. Today we are going to go through a couple different pieces, just talking about the prevailing models and practices in fundraising, talking about community-centric fundraising, which to most people is a fairly new movement. You are going to have some times in breakout groups to start to think about different ways you can bring some of these ideas to your own organization. And then I will be available for questions. So please also feel free to throw your questions in the chat or send them to me directly. I want to make sure that you all get what you need out of the session today. So just to get started, philanthropy. Can I have folks, if you feel comfortable, share in the chat how you define philanthropy? Most people will say the textbook definition from the root words that come from the Greek language, which is love of humankind, right? That is what philanthropy means. And over the course of time, the last 600 years or so, we have seen the term philanthropy come to mean something that is more attached to financial resources, right? It goes beyond this idea that we have care and compassion for our sister and fellow community members. It means that we have money to give. And when we think of philanthropy, or when you all think of philanthropy, who do you think of? What kinds of people do you think of? You can drop them in the chat. I'm not going to make you unmute.
Wealthy people.
Wealthy people, right? Big corporations, business people, right? Does anybody on this call right now think they're a philanthropist? Yay. Okay. So Marina thinks that they're a philanthropist. Do you want to tell us why you feel that way? And you can unmute if you want, or you can just drop it in the chat.
Hiya, can you hear me? Hi. Because I think anybody who gives in any way to any charity is a philanthropist. It's just that we use the word and think about large scale giving.
Yeah.
At the moment.
Yeah.
Rather than what we all do, which is, however much people give, £5 here, £10 here, every time they go, give a bigger donation to a company, but it's all philanthropy.
Right. No, I really appreciate that, Marina. Thank you. And I think that that's accurate. When we have resources and we choose to share them, we are a philanthropist. But that term has really been co-opted by by folks that have a lot of resources, by the big corporations, by business people. I love that Lucy has dropped old white men in the chat, because here in the US, when I think about philanthropy, I think about Bill Gates, I think about Jeff Bezos, I think about all of the old white businessmen, Warren Buffett, right? Those are the folks that I think about. And I know that my peers, even if they are generous with organizations in their communities, don't always feel that way. But what we know when we think about the history of how philanthropy has become less about the love of humankind and more about a donor's ability to give money or how we disperse wealth, there are a few things that inform that history. And I am going to share some things, and I welcome you to chime in the chat. You will get bored if you're only listening to me talk, at your little images on the screen for 2 hours. So I would love for this to be interactive. But when we look at the way that philanthropy has evolved as a concept, we see a couple things, right? We see a history where whiteness, whether it is in the UK, whether it is in the United States, has sort of guided the way that capitalism has shown up, that money has shown up in communities. And I know at least here we have policies that have created opportunities for folks to be able to protect their money, right? So it's not so much that in some cases, philanthropy and the way that we look at our resources is guided by what community thinks. It's really been what private citizens have thought they want to do, or private organizations have thought they want to do to serve community. And while that has had some really incredible results for organizations, when we look at universities or hospitals, we haven't, as philanthropists, done the best job of putting our own needs and desires aside and listening to what the communities that we seek to serve are asking us for. And so we see this showing up in the sort of prevailing model that exists in fundraising around the world, which is essentially donor-centered fundraising. So there is a researcher that is located here in the United States. Her name is Penelope Burke. She is an incredibly wise and smart woman. And a few decades ago, she authored a book called Donor-Centered Fundraising that really has served as the foundation for how we do work in our sector. And donor-centered fundraising has like a pretty simple approach, right? If you keep your donors happy, they will give you more money, right? It's very easy to understand, right? If we are meeting the needs of people with resources, we will get more resources that can then go into our organization. So it really, as it states, it puts the donor and the donor's needs at the center of our activities as fundraisers. And it really focuses on the sort of bottom line mentality in the sector that if we have resources, if we keep our donors happy, we can do the work, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, and again, you can drop your thoughts in the chat. What has donor-centered fundraising looked like for you? I know for some of the organizations that I work with here in the US, we like to have swag for our donors, right? And they get better swag depending on how much they give, or when we have giving circles to recognize contributions. The more money that you give, sort of the more recognition you get. Your name goes on the building or on the conference room or on the bricks, Let me peek into the chat and see. Yes, so spending a lot of time on a relatively small number of people, right? Because that small number of people have a lot of money, right? And if we try to spend our time with them, maybe we'll get a little piece of that amount of money, right? What else? How else does donor-centered fundraising look? I think about when I'm asking for funds from different kinds of institutions or from grant makers, that the grant maker sets the rules, right? The nonprofit does not get to set the rules. We are told what kind of money we can ask for. We are told how often we can ask for it. We are required to report on what we did with the money. There's a little bit of a power imbalance with those institutions. But so there's another example. Oh yay, now, look at you guys lighting up the chat. Okay, so we have giving them VIP tours. Yes, when you give a lot of gifts, you get access to me, you get access to my organization, you get access to, you get different kinds of abilities to influence the organization. Yes, prospecting, cultivation, relationship management. There's a whole process where you're essentially building this transformational relationship. Sometimes I think about, I'm like, oh, I need to send that donor like a card and maybe a little gift, like we're dating now or something. Like we're trying to build a really personal relationship with these folks where they trust us and they want to share their resources. I like what Alex shares. So money may provide favors through the organization, right? So do we get some special perks as a donor? Do we get to experience something that we might not otherwise get to experience if we make a contribution to an organization? Okay, so Dennis asked, would you classify trusts and foundations as donors? So yes and no. I think that there's obviously a different mechanism for how we engage with individuals versus how we engage with trusts and foundations. But I do think that when we think about the philosophy, the practice of donor-centered fundraising, we typically have to show up as fundraisers with the same characteristics with individual donors that we would with those institutions. I love this one-to-one meetings, listening to their ideas about what charities should do, even if they're not an expert, right? Even if they're not an expert in the important work that our organization is doing. When we get a gift of a certain size, we might have to take their advice, right? Stewardship, I love stewardship for all donors. Thank you. Not just the donors that give a lot of money. So yes, you guys are naming some really awesome things, right? There are really great practices in the donor-centric fundraising space that have served the relationships we need to support our organizations. And there are some ways in which donor-centric fundraising hasn't met the full needs, the full critical needs of the nonprofits, of the third sector. So when you think about donor-centric fundraising, what gets left out? What do we not have? What do we forget about when we are engaged in a donor-centric fundraising practice? For me, I sometimes think about, I often find myself having to, in some conversations with donors, not share my opinion, especially if it's different from theirs. Because I don't, want to ruffle their feathers or upset them or say something that, might make them question if they want to make a contribution to the organization. There have been times where I've been speaking with an individual donor and they're really excited about this really specific thing in our organization that I actually don't need to fundraise for, like that I might already have funding for, right? But like they want their money to grow there. And if I have to say, actually, like, no, that's not like the highest and best place, right, for your money to go. Am I putting my organization in a tough spot? You all are sharing, difficult conversations, not biting the hand that feeds. We have to use language that matches their funding criteria. That makes me bonkers. That makes me nuts. There are some ethical, yes, Polly, thank you. There are some ethical concerns with donor-centric fundraising. But one of the things that, I think really sits with me and where the community-centric fundraising model comes from, or movement comes from, is that when we put donors and donor needs at the center of our work, we are leaving out the very community or stakeholders that we seek to serve. And this is a shift, right, for fundraisers, I think, to think about, because I know, when I went to school and for the first decade that I spent in fundraising, the goal was to make money. The goal was to hit my budget. The goal was to get that donor to give again. The goal was to get that donor to give more again. And I did those things, right? Except for that, nothing really shifted for my organization when I was doing that work. Sure, we made our budget, and I have worked for Habitat for Humanity. So we built those houses. I have worked in education, and we got all these kids registered with these kinds of test scores. And, we have all these metrics, but the problem wasn't being fixed, right? I had not, with the money that I had raised and the relationships that I had built, I was hitting a very great target of making sure my organization was financially viable, but we were not living into a space where we could really engage with our mission or vision as an organization and be transformative. And so back in 2015, here in the US, Darren Walker, who is the current president and CEO of the Ford Foundation, authored a blog that's on the Ford Foundation's website. You can Google it now. That was called Words, a New Gospel of Wealth. And one of the things that he shares in this is that it's actually not enough for us to share our money and resources. It's not enough for us to encourage our donors to share their money and resources in a way that makes them feel good, right? We have to start to look at what is happening in our communities and what our communities are telling us they need. And we have to be willing to change the way that we engage with people, to change the way that we engage with donors. He is obviously speaking from the perspective of a philanthropist, understanding that there have been a lot of uneven power dynamics, right, in this conversation. There have been a lot of ways in which I know in the UK and here, nonprofits and third sector organizations have been asked to stay out of politics and to not advocate for certain things. And that hasn't worked, right? It hasn't worked for our organizations to be able to advance their efforts. So in 2017, you may recognize this person, you may not. This is Vu Le, posing with many unicorn toys, which are his favorite. He is a blogger that lives in Seattle, Washington, here in the US, and he has been writing a blog for many years called Nonprofit AF. And I will let you decide what the AF stands for. But Vu in 2017 offered us a new and different way of thinking about fundraising. He is a passionate fundraiser. He is a lifelong fundraiser. And he also realized that there are these really intractable, complex problems in fundraising, in philanthropy. And we fundraisers have an opportunity to show up differently in our work, right? In a more transformative and less transactional way. And so back in 2017, he authored the blog, The 9 Principles of Community-Centric Fundraising. And it was really to start a conversation in community. So what is community-centric fundraising? So community-centric fundraising is a movement that is grounded in equity and social justice and prioritizes the entire community over individual organizations. It is very different from donor-centric fundraising in that I would offer a couple different things for you to consider. Donor-centric fundraising is a practice, right? It's how we do our work. Community-centric fundraising is more about thinking and analyzing the system in which we operate in making different decisions, not just with our own time and our own resources and the resources of our own institution, but something that, as this is, it prioritizes the entire community over individual organizations. When I heard about community-centric fundraising back in 2017, my mind was blown, part of me was like, this is the thing that I have been waiting for. This is awesome. This is so exciting. I love what this looks like. And the other part of me was like, no, this is wrong, because my job is to raise money. My job is to raise money quickly. My job is to raise enough money for this organization to function. And I don't need to think about other organizations. They are my competition. I have scarcity mindset, right? I cannot share. I need to get what my organization needs for us to be successful. It was hard, right, for me to sit with. And when I think about what it means to be in a movement, right, not just practicing something in my job, there's a lot of ways to think about it. And so when I talk about community-centric fundraising as a movement, I offer this social change ecosystem map, which is a product of the Building Movements Project here in the US. And it gives us a bigger idea of how we participate in the change that our community desires. So again, Google is your friend. These resources are on the internet, you can access them. But where do we as fundraisers show up in this movement? I often find myself in the storyteller role, that I have an obligation to be honest and authentic with my donors, to help them understand and bring them along on a journey, which also sometimes makes me a guide for my donors. I sometimes feel like I'm the frontline responder. I sometimes feel that I'm the visionary. I'm trying to build a story with them that isn't true yet about my community or my cause. So I would encourage you, if you are a person that is going to be a lifelong fundraiser, be a person that plans to engage in your career with this work, to figure out where you fit in the movement, right? Because community-centric fundraising is more than a practice, right, that you're going to adapt with your donors, but it is an opportunity for us to shift the ways in which philanthropy and nonprofits and those relationships have shown up in community. So I always like to say, we know I've shared with you now what community-centric fundraising is, but let's talk a little bit about what community-centric fundraising is not. So it's not new. The principles of community-centric fundraising, which I'm going to go over in a second, they've been around for a long time, right? They've been around since before we put laws and rules and policies and regulations around philanthropy. Community-centric fundraising is not something that you can do alone, right? I alone am not going to be the only person in my organization that is able to implement these types of relationships and changes. It's not linear or finite or exhaustive. There is always going to be ways in which we can grow and learn in the movement. There is not one answer, right? This is not the solution to all of your nonprofit or third sector woes. And this work is not impossible. And I want to make that really clear, because change is hard. Like, there is a way that we have learned to do things. We are comfortable with the way that we have learned to do things. We like it. And when we are asked to change, even if we want to change the way that we do our work, it can be really uncomfortable. I often, think about when my children were small, so they're 6 and 10 now, but when they were little and I had to potty train them, right? They had lived their whole lives up until a certain point going to the bathroom in their diaper, right? And I had to figure out how to shift their mindset to get them to do it a different way. And that different way was actually better for them, but they didn't know it. They were not ready for it. And there was a lot of rewards and a reinforcement and trying and failing. And then we figured it out together, right? So sometimes as a parent, these are like my parent analogies, when I am thinking about this work of community-centric fundraising, I want to be excited about small milestones. I want to be excited about small wins. And I also want to accept that sometimes we're going to try things with our donors that aren't going to work. And we're going to learn from those things, and we're going to keep moving forward. So there are, at this point, 10 principles of community-centric fundraising. And I would offer that this list is more so a floor than a ceiling for the work that, that we're going to do. And you can find more information about community-centric fundraising at community-centricfundraising.com. But I will read these to you and would be interested for you to drop in the chat, is your organization already showing up in a certain way? Are there bullet points on here that seem really hard to you, that seem really easy to you? And we can sort of go from there. So fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. Individual organizational missions are not as important as a collective community. Nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. All who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member. That's a big one. That's a hard one. Equally valued, right? Time is valued equally as money. We treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent, assume the best intentions, and occasionally have difficult conversations. We foster a sense of belonging, not othering. Here we go. All right. We promote the understanding that everyone, donors, staff, funders, and board members personally benefit from engaging in the work of social justice. And you're going to laugh at me, but your faces are over 9 and 10. So if I could get a volunteer to read 9 and 10, that would be amazing.
I can do that.
Thank you, Holly.
We see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. We recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice.
Thank you so much.
You missed the end of number 8, which I thought was actually quite interesting.
Oh.
There was a last little bit that said, we promote the understanding that everyone personally benefits from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. I thought that was
Thank
really
you. What sticks out about that for you?
Because as came up when we were thinking about what's philanthropy, it's one way that people are benefiting us rather than acknowledging that people are getting a benefit.
Yeah.
Even if it's not as direct as a check.
Yeah. Yeah. What other thoughts do people have about these principles? Are they exciting? Are they terrifying? Do they align with what you would like to do within your organization? And we'll give you a minute to drop some thoughts in the chat. So while you're thinking about that, the other piece that I want to share with you is the movement on the other side of the table. So we hear about community-centric fundraising. We hear about these ideas of beginning to put our stakeholders in the community we seek to serve at the center. But the question that I always get is what's happening with funders? What are funders and donors talking about? And so there is also a global movement around what is being termed as justice philanthropy or just philanthropy that requires these sort of two pieces for those with resources to consider as they're engaging with nonprofit organizations and individuals. So what is justice philanthropy? They're still figuring it out the same way that we're figuring community-centric fundraising out. But it involves these 2 points, right? A shift in the way we think about capital. So a shift away from this idea that individuals and institutions can accumulate piles and piles and piles of money and that they alone can make decisions about how those dollars should be allocated. I often think about a philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie, who benefited greatly from the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. And one of the greatest legacies that he left us with was our network of public libraries. So our public library system was largely formed because of his funding. And we are now living in an era where we are having to deal with the impact of the Industrial Revolution on climate change, right? And Andrew Carnegie was not an environmentalist. That is not where his money went. How do we figure out how to move our funders towards and let our funders choose to move towards this idea where collective well-being of the community is prioritized, and it is less about where money is accumulated, but where funders and donors are able to direct their money at the request and desire of the community and not what feels good or what cause they're interested in. The other piece of this is shifting philanthropy away from an idea where the donor or the foundation maintain power because they have wealth, and they have an opportunity as the donor and the funder to move towards a space where we are thinking about financial resources and power differently, and we are more willing to transfer resources into the hands of our nonprofit organizations, into the hands of community who have likely been impacted by these types of structures. So this conversation about how do we really figure out a way for our sector and the systems in our sector to work. It's not just happening on the fundraiser side, it's also happening on the philanthropic side of this. So what's the goal? I'm sure that you've seen this image or similar images before, but what is the goal of community-centric fundraising, right? And I would offer a couple of things. The initial goal that we set out for is liberation, right? How do we create the opportunity for our organizations, for the communities that we serve to not need us anymore, right? How do we create a space where people have the resources that are needed to be able to thrive, to be able to belong, to be able to have what they need, right? It would be, I can't even imagine the world in which we would not need philanthropy. We would not need private foundations and private citizens to share their wealth because everybody in our community had what they needed to thrive. That's the goal, right? I often also think about the part of this that I can't imagine. So is there a fourth box? And if there was a fourth box, what would it look like? And sometimes I joke around that the fourth box is that I would not be stuck watching a baseball game because I am not a huge sports fan, though. Don't tell my husband and my children I said that. But what does the fourth box look like? And what is our responsibility to move our community in that direction? So I share all of this. I share all of this information about community-centric fundraising, about why we think it's important, about our opportunities to move away from harm reduction and get closer to systems change. And these are some of the things that I hear from people. This is great and wonderful, but I have an organization to run, or I have to raise this money, or I'm not going to keep the lights on, or I have a board of directors that's a little, over helpful, not helpful. I don't like change. Our donors are going to get upset. And what if they don't give us the money? My staff doesn't want to learn anything new. What they're doing is working. I don't have time. We don't have a plan. There are many things. And then of course, in this chapter of life, we are in a pandemic, right? So what is our risk tolerance in this? And so I want to offer a set of examples of how some of these principles have shown up in the work that I've been doing with nonprofit organizations and donors, just to kind of get you guys thinking a little bit creatively about what's possible for your organizations and for you. And then after I go through these examples, we are going to take some time for you to split into groups to have some conversation about your own organizations, potentially what you struggle with, and what we can do collectively, what we can learn from each other to try to start to do our work a little bit differently in the service of our organizations, in the service of mission, in the service of vision. So there is an organization here called Generate Health. It is an organization that has been focused on reducing maternal infant mortality, and it's about 23 or 24 years old. And back in 2016 or 2017, they did a big study, and all their data shared this awesome news that over the course of the first 20 years that Generate Health had been active in our community, they had drastically reduced maternal infant mortality. It was an exciting report. It was one of those things where a nonprofit thinks, oh my gosh, like we did it, like we set out to solve a problem and we have done good work. And then they decided to look at their data in a little bit of a different way. And what they found is that in the St. Louis region over the 20 years, what was true is that there had been an epically wonderful reduction of maternal infant mortality for white moms and white babies, but that in that same period, the maternal infant mortality rates for Black moms and Black babies had gone down. So their board had to sit with this reality that even though on its face, the numbers that they'd seen looked good, there was an entire population of our community that was still being harmed and not being served. And so back in 2017, the board of directors at Generate Health made the decision to shift their mission to explicitly name maternal infant mortality rates in Black moms and Black babies as the organization's direction. It was a really big deal. A lot of people had a lot of feelings about it. There are some board members that left the organization because they did not think that that was an appropriate choice for the organization to make. But at the end of the day, what was true for them was that if they were going to be a mission-driven organization, they had to look at and serve every single mom and baby living across the community. And so over the course of the last 4 years, they have started to shift into being a more community-centric organization. They have partnered with Black-led organizations to figure out, to center moms, to center doulas, to hear from children, to figure out how do we actually shift the way that we do our work and the way that we use our resources to meet the needs of the community members that were left out in our first set of attempts. So the second example I have sort of covers two of the principles. Individual organizational missions are not as important as a collective community, and nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. So there is an organization here in our community called Forward Through Ferguson. Forward Through Ferguson is the organization that was created after the Ferguson Commission sunsetted back in 2015. And I think you will likely know, but Ferguson, Missouri, here near St. Louis, is where Michael Brown was murdered by a police officer back in 2014. So this organization had the opportunity to have a fundraiser back in 2020 that, was going to bring in funds for the organization. And it had been a really weird year because COVID had started, and we had paused some of our fundraising efforts because Forward Through Ferguson is more of an advocacy organization. And we realized in COVID times, we needed to sort of throw some of our fundraising energy behind our partners who are doing direct service work in the community, helping with housing, helping with education, diapers, healthcare, all that stuff. And so we sort of prepared for this fundraiser, hoping for the best, but knowing that we may not hit our fundraising goals in 2020. And then, as all of you know, in May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is about 8 hours away from St. Louis. an 8-hour drive. And all of a sudden, people from all over the country, all over the world, were giving to Fort Ferguson. This had never happened before. There's something obviously about George Floyd's murder that sparked something. And so whereas Fort Ferguson had found themselves in kind of an uncomfortable spot, like, are we going to make our budget this year? Are we going to be able to do what we need to do? All of a sudden had made its 2020 budget, by the end of May. And so instead of having this fundraiser for ourselves, we wound up having the fundraiser and then giving the money that we raised away to these 4 nonprofit organizations who were like boots on the ground doing like real-time, short-term work in the community. We were transparent with our donors that we had changed the purpose and the reason for the fundraiser. Do you know how many donors got mad at us for deciding to give their money away to other organizations that needed it more than we did? How many donors got mad at us? Right. No donors. 0 donors said, this is terrible. I wanted you to hoard that money. Why did you give my money away? Right. We had, I think, 250 folks that contributed to this event, and not a single one of them said, I don't agree with your decision. So we had an opportunity to be mutually supportive of other organizations. And when we did it, it set an example that it is okay to share resources and your donors are not going to be mad about it. Next example, all who engage in and strengthen the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member. And time is valued as equally as money. So there are 2 examples here that I appreciate. The first one is called iHelp, the Immigrant Home English Learning Program. And they're an organization who thrives on the desire and ability for volunteers to be willing to go to the homes of immigrants and refugees here in the community and help them learn English in a space that is safe for them. The other example is KDHX, which is a community radio station that has been primarily driven by volunteers for its whole existence. Both of these organizations need to raise money, but the philanthropy, the generosity, the love of humankind they seek is less a willingness of people to share their monetary resources, but for people to share themselves, to share some of their time, which is actually sort of the higher resource needed to advance these organizations towards their mission. We treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent, assuming the best intentions, and occasionally have to have difficult conversations. And we foster a sense of belonging, not othering. So this is a pet care organization called Gateway Pet Guardians that is located in East St. Louis, which is in Illinois. So it's across the river from where we are. The week of, I think, our presidential inauguration, they found this stray dog in their predominantly Black community. Somebody dropped this dog off at the shelter, and they thought that it would be appropriate to name the dog Kamala. Kamala Harris is our vice president at the moment, and she is a Black and South Asian woman. And so a white-led organization with a whiteboard thought it would be honoring, right, to our incoming vice president to name this dog Kamala. And in their predominantly Black community they serve, they had a lot of outrage and a lot of upset people that felt diminished and felt upset and felt incredulous that an organization would think that it was a nice thing or a respectful thing to name a dog after the incoming woman of color vice president of our country. And they apologized. They wrote a letter to their community that was very transparent, that they made a bad choice, and that they wanted to own the decision that they made and that they had an opportunity to do better. When this happened, when they sent that letter, they had 2 donors who sent them a communication saying, we're not going to give to you anymore. This is ridiculous. We shouldn't be talking about race in at Gateway Pet Guardians. I will no longer give to you. And they saw an increase in contributions from first-time donors who had a lot of respect for what they did. And now they have an opportunity to continue to grow and cultivate those relationships with new donors who saw them act with integrity and make a different choice, right? So there's a way that we can communicate as fundraisers. There's a way that we can show up honestly and authentically. And that is something that our donors will connect with. Okay, so we promote the understanding that everyone personally benefits from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. This is a hard one for folks. So the woman on your screen is my colleague, Natalie. She used to work for a institutional funder called the Kauffman Foundation, which funds a lot of STEM oriented activities for kids and for education. And they also fund in the entrepreneurship space. So in the middle of the pandemic, Natalie moved back to St. Louis and decided to be the executive director of an organization here that is building like a STEM ecosystem for children from preschool all the way to college. And one of the first things that she did as executive director was have a training called Moving Boldly Towards Anti-Racism in STEM. And it was a 90-minute open call for all of her donors, funders, and partners to learn about anti-racism and how we can show up in anti-racist ways in the STEM field. So I need to tell you that every one of her donors that showed up was an older white man. Whoever called that out earlier, you're making me laugh, right? So her philanthropist community was these older white men who were business owners who had accumulated personal wealth, who had an opportunity to learn, right? They weren't forced to show up to this call. And so for 90 minutes, they had a conversation. And there's no cancel culture, right? Everyone had the opportunity to listen. People had opportunity to ask questions in a safe space. And again, do you know how many donors or how many funders after she had this call said, I don't want to talk about anti-racism, so I'm not going to give my money to your organization anymore? How many people were mad about it? How many people thought that Natalie should be fired for talking about these things? Right? None. Zero. Nobody was mad. And in fact, she kept getting feedback from her donors that they are not invited to these kinds of conversations and they have not known where to go to learn. And when an organization created a space for them to learn, they decided to do it and they felt welcome and they felt safe to ask their questions and they felt more a part of community than they had before, right? So let's not assume that our donors are like awful human beings who are not going to want to talk about hard things, right? Some of them are, some of them, sure, great. But let's assume the best intentions and let's assume that we have people in our community who want to learn about our work in a way that we have not felt comfortable to share. And now we have a responsibility to be honest and authentic with our donors about what our organizations actually need, not what they want to hear that we need, right? What they actually need to be successful. We see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. So this organization is called the Fit and Food Connection. Both of these women live in an area of St. Louis that has a lot of disinvestment, that, you know, there are not a lot of grocery stores, there are not a lot of amenities in this community. The community is high poverty, many people of color in this community, and they wanted to do something. And instead of making assumptions about what they thought community needed or what they wanted to provide to community. They went door to door and asked questions about what folks wanted and formed this nonprofit called the Fit and Food Connection, where they essentially have created opportunities for people in community to experience yoga, to do meditation, to have community gardens, and then like learn how to cook the food that they're growing in their community gardens, right? So it wasn't that a philanthropist or an organization had an idea and they wanted to go out and get it funded. They went to their community first. They got an idea of what their community actually needed. And that is what they take to their donors and their funders when they are asking for funds to support their work. Okay, and then the last example lands with principles 9 and 10. So we see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. And we recognize that the healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. So this is one of my favorite examples because it's a little bit different from what we think of when we're operating in this space. But the long and the short of it is that a local funder, the Deaconess Foundation, partnered with a local nonprofit called Metropolitan Congregations United and another organization, another large nonprofit in New York City called RIP Medical Debt. And essentially what they did was the Deaconess Foundation matched some contributions that MCU had raised. And then they used about $1 million that they had raised to purchase the medical debt of hundreds of people living and working in the St. Louis community. And by doing this, they changed the economic and financial standing of these folks, right? Because when you sometimes have medical debt, your wages are garnished. When you have medical debt, you are scared to seek medical help for yourself, for your loved ones, for your children. They were able to use $1 million to erase almost $13 million of medical debt. And so it was a different way for us to orient and use our resources as nonprofit organizations. So I offer all of these things for us to now have some time to think about these ideas, these principles, our organizations, and spend some time talking to each other.